All right, people are coming in. Welcome, everybody. We're going to give maybe about a minute or two for people to enter. Thanks for joining us. We are going to get started here in a minute, and I will make some introductions. And we are so excited to have Toni Pepe with us today, and also Renèe Brown. My name is C. Meyer. I am the exhibitions director here at Blue Sky Gallery in Portland, Oregon. Toni is joining us from Boston area, right?
But
And then Renèe, are you also in the Boston area? Okay. We ask them to be quiet. Um, okay, they need to be. Sorry, we just got some last minute visitors visiting. All right. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the talk. So if folks have questions, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then I'll moderate the questions through the chat between Toni and Renèe. So again, welcome. We're excited to have our April exhibiting artist, Toni Pepe, with us tonight, alongside Renèe Brown. Toni's exhibition, Mothercraft, opened last Thursday to our biggest exhibition opening we've had since I've been at Blue Sky since 2021. So if you're in the Portland area, please, we'd love to see you here. Come check out the show. We also have a show by Andre Ramos Woodard on the walls. Two great shows happening right now. So I'm going to just do a quick introductions, and then I'm going to hand it off to Toni and Renèe. So Toni Pepe is a visual artist whose creative practice is grounded in photographic processes, memory, storytelling, and identity as seen through a feminist lens. Found photographs from both private and public collections play a crucial role in her practice. Pepe often uses vernacular press images to explore alternative notions of an archive, as well as different modes for collecting and preserving knowledge. Pepe is currently chair and assistant professor of photography at Boston University, where she has helped to build and now launch a new MFA in print media and photography. Currently, she is exhibiting at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and the Boston and at the Athenaeum, and was a MacDowell Fellow in 2024. Her work is in the permanent collections at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the Boston Athenaeum, the Danforth Art Museum, Candela Books and Gallery, the Magenta Foundation, as well as many private collections. Welcome, Toni. We're so excited to have you here. And Renèe Brown is a PhD candidate at Boston University. Her research explores photo archives, text-image relationships, visual anthropology, and photo-based philosophies of knowledge. She is currently working on a dissertation about photo librarian Paul Vanderbilt. And then this is just a couple of install shots at Blue Sky currently. So these are two of our walls here. Toni is taking up four of our walls when you first walk into the gallery. The show's brilliant. Again, if you're in the Portland area and you have time to come by in this next month, we would love to see you here to see this amazing show. So I'm going to stop my share and pass it over to Toni and Renèe. Thank you so much for being here.
hey, thank you so much to C and everyone at Blue Sky Gallery for all your work and getting the exhibition up on the walls. I know that that is no small feat. Thank you all for being here tonight, and to Renèe Brown for joining me and being in conversation. This is a little bit of an experiment, a little non-traditional artist lecture. So I'm excited to be doing this with you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for this invitation and the chance to speak with you about your work, which I love. I just want to get that out there first and foremost. And everybody should go see it. But seriously, like, your work really speaks to me a lot about things that I'm very interested in, that I think are kind of the most juicy aspects of photography. Things like the photographic archive and the relationship between text and image, and really the power of old photographs to speak to us in striking ways in the present, ways that may be a far cry from their original intended meaning. But I know we'll get to some of that down the road in our conversation, but I wanted to start off just by grounding us a bit more in your work and hearing a bit more about how you created it, and what processes you used.
Yeah, great. I'm going to share my screen so we can look at some things as we're talking. Do that. Great. So this work is made up of found press photos depicting mothers and children in the US media throughout the 20th century. So when I began collecting these newspaper photographs right around 2015, and I sort of came across them accidentally while I was on eBay looking for another kind of photograph. And I was immediately attracted to these prints as objects. You know, they're like these little time capsules marked up with date stamps and tags and captions and crop marks. And these are two of the earlier press photos that I found and then later made these pieces with. And if you're not familiar with what a press photograph is, these are just some snapshots I took of some of my own on the right here, and then some from a public collection on the left. And essentially, a newspaper photograph was a form of a filing system for a newspaper. Throughout the 20th century, when a photograph was published by a newspaper, they would take a print of it, and not any sort of a precious print. It was a print that was meant to be handled. It served a very specific function. And so oftentimes, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but oftentimes you'll see this kind of white masking to cover up certain aspects of the image, or crop marks. You'll see on the backs all of this really lovely information, like the pieces of the article or captions. You might even see a date stamp, and you might see another date stamp and then repeat it again and again because that photograph was used repeatedly, and sometimes over the span of a decade or more. And you'll also find other information related to the photograph that might seem a little cryptic if you don't know photo lingo, so I think that's also kind of interesting that it points toward this photo history and the history of the photographic print. Um, and if you sort of ignore that text, you'll almost kind of see, and I'm going to click back for a second, you'll see these images that are at once really familiar and almost cliche, right? These images of mothers and children and embrace, really nurturing. But it's really the text that reveals this history of the photo as this object in the world, as an object that existed, in time and in space, something that was used and reused, and then, sort of eventually abandoned. So. And then how I'm making them. So this is my setup. Um, it's pretty basic. I'm just hanging the press print. You can see the print right here. I'm suspending it and then backlighting it with a strobe. And I'm facing the back of the print toward the lens. And so then the resulting image is what you'll see in the show. And so what's happening is when that light passes through, you're getting both the front and the back of the image at once. So that information, that all that text, all of that, those markings are now kind of blending together with the image. And so that sort of gesture that we often do when we look at a photo and then flip it over and look at the back, that gesture has been compressed into one moment. And so then you're seeing everything kind of all at once.
That's so amazing. It's really great to hear about like your attraction to photographs as objects, and then also that process of compressing, the what we might call the metadata, sort of an analog version of that, and the image itself. So I was wondering, how did the idea for the Mothercraft series develop alongside this process? Was it kind of like idea first and then finding a process that kind of helped articulate it, or finding images that then gave birth to the idea?
Yeah, I think there's like a couple of different ways to answer that question, and there's I think on one end of it, I'm really interested in the photograph as an object, and even looking at some of these installation shots. And if any of you have seen the work in person, you'll know that the prints are they're this really thin kozo paper, and then the print is then allowed to just suspend and hang in the frame, and so the bottom is loose, and so the paper is allowed to just sort of bend and curl and ripple and sort of be alive, right? And react to time and the elements. And so I'm interested in carrying through, right, even in my presentation, this idea of the photo as object. And so that's something that's always been part of my process. And so I think that's why I was really attracted to the press prints in general. And then this is just a shot of one of the many tables in my studio that is a complete disaster and chaos at any moment in time. But they're usually these tabletops littered with found photographs and other photo ephemera that are stained and curled paper and creases and fingerprints and images that haven't been fully fixed. And again, the sort of tactile and all of the marks are the things that I'm really interested in. And I think for me too, it's because of this interest in the body. And so this is some other work that I've done, which I'm making cyanotypes using breast milk. And that's like sort of in process. If you've made a cyanotype, you recognize that. And I love the simplicity of the cyanotype, that you're able to just, you just need sun and the coated paper and water. This is the finished piece here on the left with the detail on the right. And so I think it's that kind of presence of the body. This is material that I made with my own body. I needed to physically press my body against the light sensitive materials to make it, and sort of bringing that body into the piece, even though it's abstracted, it's still quite present. And then also, quite literally using the body too in other forms of my work. These are my children on the left. I'm making molds of their belly buttons, some belly buttons in progress on the right. And so the way that I kind of got to Mothercraft was sort of this long and winding road that feels like it's the same path. It just sort of takes these different turns, I think. Because I'm using all of these materials sort of pointing back toward the hand and the presence of the human touch and the mark in these sort of different ways. But I think always photographic, if that makes sense. Like even the mold is, for me, photographic in that it has a positive and a negative. It's the sort of idea of impression. Yeah, and it's able to sort of capture in a way that the photograph, it sort of picks up where the photograph fails a bit, right? With scale and texture and things that the photo doesn't do the best job with that. So
it's great that you're thinking about photography in this very multi-dimensional sense, that it's not just about an image, it's the whole different kinds of processes, like the exposure, the making an impression. But it's interesting with the press photographs that you use. Those are, it's all about women's bodies, baby bodies. But there's kind of this almost distance or removed, like they're kind of these sterile images in a way. And maybe that's kind of a product of the type of photography that they represent, these sort of press photography, but also almost like stock photography in a way. So I'm curious to hear a bit more about what drew you specifically to working with this type of imagery, with found photographs, maybe saying a bit more about where you found them and kind of what was the compass that sort of like led you to pick out certain images.
Yeah, and so I sort of stumbled on the press photograph by accident while I was looking for other images. So I've collected found photographs for as long as I can remember. They fill the shelves in my studio, albums, loose photographs, and even newspaper clippings, Liberty cases, carte de visites, all of these things. They are just all over my studio and they've always surrounded me. And I feel like they've always been a part of my practice, that just in this sort of quieter way. Um, and and now they're sort of coming to the forefront more. And I think for me, when I kind of think about when I'm referencing and kind of talking about the body in relation to the press photo, I'm not even really thinking about the image. I'm thinking about the hands that touched that print, right? The hands that made those crop marks, and masked the image and, made all those adjustments, the creases and the folds that were made, or even some images have fingerprints on them for the person who processed them. So I'm thinking about all this sort of behind the scenes labor too to make that print and get that image published. And, oftentimes, well, I would say probably 100% of the time, that's not the voice of the mother who's being pictured, right? So I think that there's these like multiple perspectives happening, with that print and with that kind of when we think about the sort of presence of that hand in there. So I think that's one thing that sort of attracted me. And I'll skip forward. I have some of my older work too we can go back to. Um, but I think that that's one of the main things that attracted me to the press photo, was just that presence of all of those markings, and thinking not just about what the image and the image can impart to the viewer, right? But it's all that other information outside of the image, that was really never meant to be seen, or seen in this way, right? Um, and what new meaning can be revealed from that.
That's so interesting. And I was, as you said the word labor, then I was also thinking of like the connections between, labor's associations with motherhood, obviously, but then also, in my research, I've been looking into kind of predominantly the women behind the scenes at photo libraries and at illustrated magazines like Life magazines. And they were the ones who were kind of calling the shots with what photographs to print and how to classify them, and really sort of adding all of this information onto them. So there's an interesting connection between the female labor of the organization and maintenance of these kinds of archives, and then also what you're depicting, the type of imagery that you're gravitating towards. So
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, and just going off of that, this idea of, caretaking is at the center of this work. And even just the notion of caretaking is usually a subject matter that is relegated to the margins. When we think about domestic labor, it's not part of the GDP of a country. It's not something that is valued in that way. And so I think that there's a lot happening in this work and in my practice too, that deals with things that are discarded, things that are dismissed. These press photos themselves have been abandoned. I mean, I'm finding them on eBay and flea markets. There was a really wonderful exhibition about Life magazine at the MFA in Boston, I think like a year or two ago. I have no sense of time. But there was this like big picture of one of the offices at Life magazine, and then you could see a trash can, and in the trash can it was filled with press prints.
yeah.
So they were not, these were things that again were served a very specific function, and when that was done, they were lost or abandoned.
Yeah, well, shout out Piggy Sargent. She was the photo editor, I think, at Life magazine at that time. And yeah, it's interesting to think about the feminized labor of organizing and maintaining images versus usually the male photojournalist who's taking the image. But I want to move on to another favorite part of the Mothercraft series, which is the text. And to ask you more about how you're thinking about the relationship between text and image.
Yeah, so when I'm collecting these photos, it's the text that is the deciding factor as to whether or not, yes, this is an image that I'm going to use or not. And oftentimes, if we look at these two examples here, there's this disconnect between the image that we're seeing and then the text that we're reading. I mean, for example, we see on the right this really lovely moment between a mother and a mother kind of having her child swaddled and she's carrying him or her and she's smiling. But then the caption references like beheading and cannibalism, and it just there's this incredible disconnect with the image on the left here. Dennis O'Neill, 6 months, is screaming for his mother who is off playing bridge. So it's, the text is really what gives us insight into the time in which these were made, but then also how they were meant to be received. And also, to a certain extent, who's doing the framing, who's through whose perspective is this being presented? And the sort of level of judgment that comes across in some of this text, it's kind of incredible when you think about journalistic standards, and there's this expectation, right, that we're supposed to be unbiased. They're supposed to be, just the facts, right? And what kind of comes through is oftentimes pretty dogmatic.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really struck me about the way that the text is functioning is its capacity to really like add a whole new twist to whatever the image is. Whatever the caption is, it's definitely not the one I would have picked to go with the image. Like if I was in charge of writing these captions, because you just don't know the context of when and why these photographs were taken. So that's one of the things I found most intriguing. So it's interesting the way that text shapes the meaning of the photographs, but I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about the way photographs impact each other's meanings, whether it's in the context of like a larger archive or in your own work working in series. There's this kind of idea that, the whole is larger than the sum of its parts, and that you can have one image and get a meaning from that, but then when you see it as part of a larger context, then that meaning might change. So yeah, throw that one to you.
Yeah, and I think when I was working on Mothercraft, I was really dealing with images one at a time. I would go out looking for them and I'd find them most of the time one at a time. And I'm photographing them one at a time, and I'm considering that text, individually. And it wasn't until I had amassed, I have over 100 and I keep adding to this body. And so it wasn't until I really started to amass a bunch of these that I started to think more of them in these groups. And it is something that I'm still thinking through, like how to organize them. It feels wrong to categorize them by a topic. Like I have lots of press photos of mothers and infants, press photos related to reproductive rights, so all of these different sort of topics, and that just doesn't feel right for them. And I think that's when I started making the grids of the images and thinking about them in these groupings and how they might speak to each other sort of visually, but then also, through the text that each one is embedded in each one, how that might provide the viewer with really this kind of expanded idea of what caretaking and motherhood, what, the sort of different aspects of society really touches upon. That there might be that more traditional kind of iconic nurturing image of mother and child next to, an image of mothers in protest, or even in images like this, where we see the mother as almost this political device, where the text is, on the left here, we see a mother who has just given birth at a military base, and there are several mothers about to give birth, and they all gave birth to twins. And one of the officers remarks that this is how armies are born. The image on the right is from the Soviet Union, and you see this mother with all these medals, and she's received the highest honor because she's had the most children in her village. And so it's like the text, I think, really grounds it. But then again, you're mentioning this idea of the images working together. I'm trying to make these little groupings. I think to just sort of, again, just kind of expand and show that kind of multiplicity of the sort of different points of view of what caretaking looks like and what it touches on.
Well, I think maybe we have time for maybe like one more question before we open it up for Q&A. And so I wanted to just end maybe with thinking more about motherhood, about what sort of brought you to this topic. What about working through this theme in photography feels particularly ripe or relevant? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to scoop back to some of my older work here we're going to go backwards in the slideshow. Sorry. So I began working on this idea of motherhood after becoming a mother myself in 2012, and I now have 3 children. And the work that I was making was really referencing the history of Western painting and thinking about representations of mothers and children in this kind of 400 to 600 span year of time, right? And looking at these gestures and expressions and poses that are sort of repeated over and over again. And sometimes I would directly reference a painting with Guido Reni's Charity from 1630 on the right, and then my version of Charity on the left from 2018. And then it sort of started to spill into Mothercraft too, sort of recognizing these gestures, these poses, seeing then those compositions again repeated again and again. But I think for me, what made me attracted to the idea of making photographs of this idea of motherhood and caretaking was that photography allows us to see the kind of flawed body and the sort of flesh and blood, right? As opposed to painting, which it's just, again, it's that presence of the body. It's like that impression of the body, the light coming off the body, making that impression on the film. There's that connection there that for me felt important. It felt right for the topic, and it felt right for me in the way that I work.
That's great. Yeah, but I'm also struck by how many of these photographs are like perpetuating this kind of mythology of the mother, but then somehow the way that they're juxtaposed with the captions and all of the stamps and all of the all of that other information somehow like short circuits that mythology, and we kind of have a moment to realize like how constructed this type of imagery is. And I think that's something that this series of work does very cannily and in a very poignant way.
Well, and I think that's also what time gives us too. I think that I'm looking back at these images that were made, 60, 70, sometimes 70, sometimes 80 years ago. And so I think that yeah, I think that I'm able to sort of see that performative aspect more clearly because of that distance of time and what that does to an image. I mean, even if we look at images, you know, from 20 years ago, you can start to feel the sort of datedness of it. Yeah,
Yeah, I could keep going with that
I know.
topic for a
Yeah.
while, but I think it's time to let other people have a chance to ask some questions.
Yeah, I will
So I'll
stop
turn it back over to
sharing
C.
and do that.
Yeah, thanks, Toni and Renee. And Renee, thanks for leading the questions to get people starting to think about Toni's process. Yeah, so for folks who are curious or have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And then I'm going to go ahead and read a couple that are already in the chat. So Suzanne Hubbard says, this is so interesting. Thank you. I'm wondering how viewing a photo as object either enhance its meaning or possibly designate a particular meaning.
Yeah, I think that I'm interested in sort of where is the meaning of the photograph, right? It's sort of this squirrely thing that wiggles around and changes, you know, over time, changes depending on the viewer. Um, and so I think that what I like about the photo as object and trying to pull meaning out of that is that, you know, what I'm seeing in that photo object is going to be different than what you're seeing. And so again, it's that sort of multiplicity of perspective. And when I'm referencing a press photo and using that as a source material, the press photo is supposed to represent this like factual record, right? It's supposed to almost have this sort of really narrow point of view. But what I'm hoping the work does is sort of explode that a bit and show that there is this varied way of reading the image and reading the photo object. So for me, it's like it's almost it's a way to just sort of upend sort of photographic meaning and make room for the sort of potential for yeah, for just this variety.
Thanks, Toni. And thanks, Suzanne, for that question. Jane Wagoner Dushner comments, I'm reminded of Robert Heineken and his work with magazine pages. Press photos are impersonal to the photographed. Have you ever considered studio portrait proofs? When I have many from the same sitting and then written on the back what the sitter selected, it's revealing to me.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I've never thought of using portrait proofs and but I have used, it's not the same, but I have used quite a bit of just vernacular snapshot photos. So photos that people have taken themselves or family member has taken, right? And I working with those feels very different than the press photo, right? Because the press photo was meant to be this very public facing image of a person. It almost becomes like that, those paintings that I was referencing in my earlier work, right? This sort of larger mythical kind of understanding of the caretaker or the mother figure. And the vernacular photos that I'm working with have sort of elements of that. There might be these like similar poses or gestures, um, but the intentions were so different. So I try to treat them differently.
Thanks, Jane, for that quite good question. Deanna Dykman asks, are these pairs shown as and meant to be diptychs? Wondering what you meant by groups.
Oh yeah, no, not diptychs. So just a way to show more images on a slide. The groupings were more just making grids for the exhibition, which I might, let me see. I think I have one. I think I have an image of the grid somewhere. I'll sort of scroll through. But yeah, there we go. It's mainly just meant to, I was referencing the grids that I put together for exhibitions. When I'm making this work, I they exist kind of at the same scale in my studio. And so I start to play with scale when I think about an exhibition and think about grouping them together and how I might group them, and wanting to avoid having a grid that references one topic, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Deanna, for that. That was a great question. And George Slade asks, Renee, could you talk about Paul Vanderbilt and his unique system of classifying picture collections? How does this relate to the issues of that Toni addresses?
Wow, thanks for that question. So Paul Vanderbilt he's a photo librarian, and his kind of biggest claim to fame that sort of puts him on the map in photo history is that he reorganized the Farm Security Administration files, which is, that was the Depression era agency that is responsible, that brought you photographs like Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, for example. And so I think the way that Vanderbilt's work connects with the work that Toni's doing is thinking about the different ways that photographs produce knowledge, and sort of his creative approach to classifying images has to do with, in order to classify a photograph, you have to understand what it's about. But, you ask 5 people to tell you what a photograph is about, you'll get 5 different answers. So it's about that kind of like slippery relationship between trying to fit and make findable photographs within a text-based system. And his entire career was about how to find better ways to organize photographs, and sort of undergirding those very practical methods was a whole philosophy about how photographs communicate, and what they communicate that's different from words.
Yeah, and I think that I've just recently started working in the Boston Public Library in their special collection, working with their Violence Against Women archive. And Renee and I have been in conversation too, just with her interest in Paul Vanderbilt, and this idea of how do we categorize, how do we organize. We're both really interested in that kind of move from the individual image to the collection, and I've become more interested in that, just having recently started working in this collection and thinking more about how, going through, if you've been to a collection, been to an archive, and you sort of leaf through these photographs, you look at one, and then typically 3 or 4 images later, it's going to inform that first image you saw, and then you keep going and it's going to keep informing the images. And that is something that was very new for me. And so I've really enjoyed being in conversation with Renee about that. So.
Thanks for that good question. Flipping gears, thinking about how you make your choices about installation, Toni. I was curious about your molds you made, because I saw a picture of the molds that you had in alongside an exhibition. And so Chris Rauschenberg has a question that I was also kind of on my mind. And he says, I saw you had an installation shot of belly buttons and Mothercrafts being in the same show. If you got to do whatever you wanted, would you have Mothercraft by itself as it is at Blue Sky, or would you prefer to combine all your series that address mothering?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the idea of having all the different approaches in one space. So having Mothercraft alongside some of my more sculptural work or 3-dimensional work, because I think they all inform one another. I am, definitely the kind of artist that, it's a slow burn. I am a slow worker. I chip away at the same idea for a really, really long time. And so, 10 years will go by and I look back and And all of these pieces are kind of in conversation with one another. So yeah, I think that in an ideal world, it would be lovely to have a show that I'm able to kind of have all the different approaches, or at least a couple of different kinds of approaches at once. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really curious about your use of repetition in particular, just getting a quick peek at those molds you had, because it was interesting how you had them like multiples. And I'm curious how you were thinking about like having that repetitive kind of stacked on top of each other. And then in tandem with your Mothercraft series, do you see like repetition happening here too, like in the work that you've selected for Blue Skies show?
Yeah, and I sort of snuck a peek at a question on here, and someone referencing sort of in family snapshots, we sort of all take the same same photos. And so that's something I'm really interested in, this idea of repetition, the repeated pose, the repeated gesture, the repeated expression, the thing we know, like we know what to do in front of the camera. We have learned that sort of ritual. And I'm really interested in ritual and repetition. And so I think I'm seeing those repeated, again, gestures, or whether or more iconic kinds of imagery in the press photo as well, you know, seeing that repetition of subject matter, or yeah, or topic, or yeah, gesture, expression, pose, all of that over and over. Yeah. And it's, you know, and it's all related to time as well too. Those belly buttons were all done throughout the course of like 4 years. And it's ongoing. So it's also this sort of a representation of time that you don't quite see the change in a belly button. It takes a long time to see a change in a belly button. So um, I know this. And so so it's also this, like, how we see time and how we experience time. And when you're so close to something, you don't necessarily see that change. And it's not until you've stepped back 5, 6, 7 years that um, you see what has developed. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that. Are you continuing to make those molds still?
I do. Yeah. My kids enjoy it. So they get candy when I do it. So they like it. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of that question about the family photos, so Jane was so the question attached to that was she was wondering about if you're interested in work addressing the more intimate and personal, like the work that you showed earlier.
Yes. 100%. And some of my work that I have been making alongside Mothercraft, and that I'm working on now, involves more intimate, personal photographs, found family albums, those private moments, the things that we might photograph, and how that might be represented differently, or how we might present ourselves differently, knowing that it's just for the album. And so I'm definitely interested in that as well.
Great. Thanks, Jane, for that great question. We have another comment question on here from someone who was here today that was able to see her. So Joanna King says, I saw the exhibition today. Wonderful. I was/am interested in the fact, though the images were originally made for public viewing, many of them are nevertheless in your treatment of them anything but idealized. Thanks, Joanna, for being here and seeing the work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, I don't know. I guess I don't think of it as not being idealized. I guess I think of it more as, I mean, I see a beauty in it, I guess, right? I see a form of beauty in that print, and in the layering, and in that sort of time being compressed. Um, I don't know. I don't know how to address sort of the idealized image. Um, I think that the print itself, because it's this object and has traveled through time and space and has sort of bears those marks of time and the wear. I think that sort of chips away at the idealization and not necessarily my treatment of it. I think that it's doing that on its own, if that makes sense. I don't know. It's also late for me, so my brain is a little fuzzy.
No worries. Yeah, it's almost 9 o'clock for you. And so we appreciate you both, Renee and Toni, for being having your brains on sharp.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other last questions for either Toni or Renee? Feel free to put it in the chat. But yeah, just so for people know, Toni's show is up through the end of the month. So we're open Wednesday through Saturday, noon to 5. Please definitely come by and see the show. They're really magnificent to see in person. Like they're really beautiful, and you can really get in and like immerse yourself in the text and step back and see them. It is also one of those as an object, so wonderful because you can really kind of come in and out. And like when I was installing these, there's one of the bigger pieces was up close, like doing some conditioning, and then I like stepped away from it, and I think I took a picture of it, and I didn't realize there was like a big picture of a face, like
Oh
just
yeah, the layered one. Yeah.
and it's like you don't necessarily see everything in like the first viewing. So it's really cool to be able to move around the gallery space and get up close, but then step back because there's so many layers in all of these that like in a quick glance, like you're not, it's like it's fun to spend time. I think we were talking about this earlier, just like the amount of time that you want to spend with each one of these to really like to get what's going on. So
Yeah, and I think too, it's just the idea of time, you look at these are newspaper photos, and how quickly do we look through, do we sort of scroll through the news now? We don't even have the newspaper to open, and that slows us down. We just sort of scroll through these news images. And so yeah, I'm hoping people will spend a little time with it and see what's revealed.
Yeah, and to your point of what you were talking about of this being a time capsule, as you guys were talking, I was thinking a lot about, in today's photos, like we don't have, like we can't look on the back in the same way that I was a collections manager at the MOCP in Chicago for a few years. And so it's just like the fun of being able to actually look through, like you're saying, and then check the backs, and it's unique to that one piece. It's like you could have multiple reproductions of the same negative, but each one of these pieces, because of where it's gone, has its own like lifetime in itself as like an object. And I think that's just like such a cool thing about having the like materiality of photographs and tangible photographs to see. So yeah, love your project. Thank you so much. I can't wait to see. I'm assuming you're still like just going to continue to work on Mothercraft. Do you see that there being like a kind of time when you'll decide like you're done with it, or is it?
Yeah, I think it's something I'll always sort of add to. I want to make a book of it, so that might make it a little bit more final. Um, and I think that working with archives, working with found photos is something that I'm continuing to sort of develop into newer work. So we'll see sort of what comes. It's usually whenever I've worked on previously, some chunk of it, some nugget leads into something else. So I'm kind of making my way toward that something else right now. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're excited to see where that goes. One last question. Looks like we've got one from Kentaro. If you, we'll do this one last one, and then we'll let everyone go to their evenings. Do you ever feel compelled to further add to the context of these works by writing on the back of your own prints? Ooh, great question, Kentaro.
Great question. Yeah. So it's funny because I never thought I was going to be a visual artist. I always thought I was going to be a writer. I never even considered visual art until I was in college. And so I write a lot about my work just personally, in journals, and whenever I'm kind of working through an idea, I usually go to writing to help me get through something. And I have found myself recently not writing my own text, but I'm actually using a pen or using something to carve into and actually follow the line of writing of somebody else. And so I'm wanting to put my hand into it. And so I don't know, it might lead to that. It might someday lead to me adding my own text. But for now, there's something about that voice that's on the back from that text that that person wrote. And I'm thinking more of like a family album photograph. There's something about that that I like working with. I like being in conversation with that handwriting and with that person, as opposed to putting myself into it. I feel like I'm putting myself into it in different other ways. Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks, Kentaro, for that great last question. And Toni, do you have any of your work up anywhere else besides Blue Sky at the moment that folks joining us might be able to see it elsewhere?
I do have Mothercraft is up at the Boston Athenaeum right now through the end of May. And then it is also included in the Tender Loving Care exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston through 2025. I think that's it. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you both, Renee and Toni. Thank you so much for your time tonight. And thanks everyone who joined us. We did record the talk, so if you want to share it or watch it again, we'll have that posted on our YouTube channel in a couple days. So please check us out on our website. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us at Blue Sky anytime. And we'll hope to see you here, folks, in person at the gallery soon. So thanks so much, everybody.